Hi, and welcome to Quilt Street. I'm Mary Kate Carpetras.
And I'm Rhonda Lothar.
And you are here for the very first episode of our Teach Me How to Quilt series, where we are going to show you all the basics of how to make that first quilt.
Yes, everything you need from the tools to start with, how to use them, how to put the blocks together, everything you need we're going to cover in this series.
You know, making that first quilt can be kind of daunting, especially, so many people want to make that first quilt, right? Maybe you've got a grandbaby on the way, or you want to make a graduation gift, or you just want to make something for yourself, but where do you start? It can be a little daunting. There are a lot of tools involved.
Yes.
There are a lot of terms and definitions that maybe you don't quite know what they mean. So we're going to be covering all of that for you so that you can feel comfortable, you know how to go buy what you need, and then you can get started at home.
Exactly. So tell me about your first quilt. How did you get started in quilting?
So this was back in the 90s. Maybe you remember, back in the 20th century. But it was before the internet was really a thing, right? It existed, but you couldn't really find a lot there. So I learned from books and magazines. And I don't know why I wanted to start quilting. I really don't. There was something about it that just appealed to me. I'm not like a visual artist. That's not my forte, but I loved the idea of making something visual, but also tactile, you know, and that was useful. So even if it wasn't like perfect and gorgeous, it could still serve some function, you know? So we have a very dear family friend who was a quilter, so maybe I sort of picked it up via osmosis from her. And she lent me a basic book, and I just sort of worked through that book. And I did it all by hand.
Oh, wow.
I was poor. I was still a student, and I didn't want to buy a sewing machine if I wasn't sure I was going to stick with this.
Right.
So I did it all by hand, pieced it all by hand, quilted it all by hand.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and so it ended up being a sampler quilt because I worked block by block through this book to learn different techniques. There's one applique block in there. Took me a couple years to finish it.
I can imagine. So did you have a family history of quilting, or was it the neighbor that influenced you more?
No, we don't. I mean, my mom didn't quilt, my grandmothers didn't quilt, or anybody in my family. My great-grandmother did make a beautiful Ruby McKim. She was a very popular designer in the 20s, and it's an embroidered bird quilt.
Oh, nice.
And I have that. And some of the embroidery thread has disintegrated, but apparently it was a really popular pattern around the time that my dad was born. So I have that, but that's it. I must have skipped a couple of generations.
I think that's not uncommon. In fact, I had a great-grandmother who I never met, but they lived in the Ozarks up in Arkansas, and they made quilts out of necessity. They had simple houses, they were farmers, and quilting was a necessity back then. Although she made some beautiful quilts, and we're actually going to show some of them on Quilt Street. But after World War II, I think a lot of that kind of died off as people became more prosperous and the baby boom happened. I remember my mother made her first quilt in the 1960s, and it wasn't until she broke a leg and couldn't really drive or go anywhere or do anything. And
so she needed something to keep herself
occupied.
Occupied.
And she made my brother and sister's clothes on the sewing machine. So she had a lot of scraps, and that's what she used. But again, she had no real instructions or anything. But I remember one story she told me was she called up her dad, my grandfather, and who still lived in the Ozarks, and told him she's making this quilt. And he said, "Well, Mona, if you need money for a bedspread, I'll be glad to send you some money." Because it was kind of considered something that poor people did.
Right.
And, how far have we come? How far has that pendulum swung?
Right. I know, right? This is not a cheap hobby. We'll talk about ways to do it on a budget, but it's not a cheap hobby these days.
But it's so fun. I mean, it is so fun.
And the thing is, quilting was definitely in a lull of popularity in the 60s.
Yes.
And then the bicentennial happened. And quilting became, all of a sudden, all these traditional American handicrafts, and we're talking specifically about quilting's popularity here in the U.S., but that it really resurged, and it really hasn't waned too much since then. It's had some ups and downs, but we're now coming up on 50 years almost since then. we don't want to talk about our ages. But, and that's where we are now.
Yes.
So as we talked about, there can be some terms, and we've already thrown out a variety of terms that maybe don't make sense if you're not already a quilter. So let's start with the basics. Let's talk about the basics. What is a quilt?
Yes, we have one that we're going to show. This is a vintage quilt top that I found. Very basic, and the top is just simply the pieced units, the fabric that is sewn together. This is a pieced quilt top. A quilt are 3 layers that are held together with stitching. You have the quilt top, which is the design portion, the middle, which is called batting or wadding, and then the backing fabric. This is backing. And together, these 3 layers are referred to as a quilt sandwich.
Yeah, so that's the basic ingredients for a quilt. Those 3 layers, sometimes you might see things that are held together just 2 layers. That's not really a quilt. It's that 3rd inner layer that gives it the loft, that gives it the warmth, its durability. That's the basics of a quilt. So,
and sometimes, batting is most commonly used. Once in a while, people will use flannel if you want a lightweight quilt. A lot of people in the South have done that in the past to make it just a little bit thinner. I've even seen people use old blankets or quilt tops for the center. Not too long ago, a friend gave me a family quilt top that needed some mending done. And as I got to the edge, there was a pretty big gap. And when I pulled that gap back, there was actually an older quilt top inside. And she had no idea it was there. But it was a case where an earlier family member had pretty much used up that quilt. And once they considered that no longer usable, it just became the center of a new quilt sandwich.
It's a quilt, 3 layers stitched together. So let's start then with the top. So this is a pieced top, patchwork top, as we might talk about. Shall we unfold it and show it a little bit more? And piecing is, the most common, I would say, technique used to make quilt tops, right?
Yes.
What are the characteristics of a piece top?
There's different units sewn together. You take fabric, you cut it apart to make a design, and then you sew it back together again. And
perfectly logical.
Yes, and all the quilts behind us are pieced as well. These are actually quilts we'll be featuring on Quilt Street, so you can find the patterns for those and make those yourself as well.
Right. So it's that patchwork that you're familiar with, where you lay the fabrics together, right sides together. We'll talk about all of this later, I promise. But you don't see the seams. They're all hidden on the underside of the quilt.
Yes.
And it tends to be very geometric. You can get curves, but tends to be straight line piecing.
Right.
So that's what we mean with piecing. So what are some other techniques? We talked about appliqué, right? So tell us about what's an appliqué.
An appliqué quilt is where you have a design, maybe flowers, stems, leaves, and you take the edges of the fabric and you turn them under. And you'll stitch those in place either by hand or machine. You can use a decorative stitch around the edge, like a blanket stitch, either by hand or machine. There's all kinds of ways to do that. But generally, appliqué are shapes that would not be achieved easily on a sewing machine by piecing the seams together.
Yeah, they tend to be more decorative, more pictorial.
Yes.
Now, I do want to just cut in, you can leave those edges raw.
True.
These days with fusible webbing. Again, that's something we'll get into in a different episode. But it's a way of layering. You basically apply the fabric to your background and to create pictures that would be difficult to do with piecing.
Exactly.
There are other techniques. There's foundation piecing. Now, you have an old example of what foundation piecing used to mean exclusively, right?
I have a vintage quilt top in my collection. It's a spider web, and I've yet to quilt that one, mainly because the foundation that the quilter used was newspapers, and I just find that so intriguing. Back before quilters had printers or the internet or even books perhaps to access, they would trace a pattern, draw a pattern on newspaper, maybe a phone book page that they're not using anymore, and they would use that to sew on as a base. And so basically you would sew onto that foundation, a paper foundation, press it open, and then continue to cover up that area.
Right. So you see that with string quilts as well.
Yes.
Great stash busters. you know. But these days, foundation piecing usually means you're making a picture that would be, again, be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve with traditional piecing techniques. You see a lot of, oh gosh, I see a lot of pop culture foundation patterns out there,
Right.
you know. So much fun, really opens up a whole world of looks that you can't get otherwise. Does tend to be a little bit more of an advanced technique, at least, or intermediate. We won't be talking about that in this series, but stay tuned for a different one. We'll get into it.
Yes, we will have foundation piece quilts on Quilt Street, and we'll show you how to do those. But you can really achieve intricate designs, get those really sharp points, and so it's a great way to put together a really complex looking quilt and have accuracy.
Now, another type of paper piecing technique is called English paper piecing. And it's pretty different, though, in how it's achieved. That's where, for instance, hexagon quilts. If you've ever seen a grandmother's flower garden quilt, that's English paper pieced, right? So do you do a lot of English paper piecing?
I don't. I've done some before, but our colleague Susan Guzman does a lot of English paper piecing. She has paper hexagons, so some stiff paper that she works with. And that's a great project if you travel or sit at the ballpark and you just need something to keep your hands busy or even watching TV. But basically you take, a lot of times a hexagon, you can use other shapes, but hexagon is probably the most common. And you baste the edges over your foundation. And you can either do that with a basting stitch or maybe a glue stick even, some people use. And then you whip stitch those pieces together.
And that's a hand stitching technique.
Yes,
it's all done by hand. So it's a beautiful, again, very decorative, but just really gorgeous.
Floral Bouquet is one of the quilts in the Quilt Street collection. You can check that out. That'll be one of our patterns that's available. And that's a great English paper piece quilt.
And then the final technique that we're going to talk about right now is the whole cloth quilt. And that is what it sounds like. It's just a whole piece of cloth, but the star is that quilting stitch,
Exactly.
right? And you see that a lot in, say, antique quilts from Wales, south of France. There's a gorgeous tradition of whole cloth quilts from France. And those are really not utilitarian quilts so much, right?
That would have been considered a quilter's best quilt or, for special occasions. I'm lucky. One of my friends traveled to England several years ago, and she found a baby quilt that was whole quilt. Whole quilt, excuse me.
Whole cloth, yes.
Whole cloth, thank you. She brought me a whole cloth quilt back. It was antique, and it had some stains on it, but it was just exquisite quilting. And one edge even has a decorative fringe on it. And I imagine that might have been used in a baby's christening or baptism, perhaps. But it's just a lovely example of a whole cloth quilt.
Yeah, I aspire one of these days to make a whole cloth quilt, but that day has not come yet. So let's talk about piecing. Let's go back to just basic traditional piecing because that's what we're going to be talking about in this series. What do we have here in front of us?
This is a non-patch quilt, and this is what we're going to make in our series. And we're going to show you everything you need to know from beginning to end. We're going to show you the tools you need, how to use them, how to sew accurately, everything you need to put this quilt together. The block is very basic. Once you master a non-patch, there are so many other quilt blocks that you can build upon just from these basic techniques you're going to learn.
We're going to be talking about how to cut your fabric, as well as how to sew it, how to piece the blocks, how to join the blocks, everything that you need to know to make the quilt top from beginning to end. Then we're going to be talking about how to finish it. We're going to be talking about different quilting techniques, binding technique, things along those lines, so that by the time we're done with this series, you'll feel so confident to go forward and make your first quilt.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us today. In our next video, we'll discuss the sewing machine and how to use it.